The Liverpool Players present The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Written and narrated by Madeline Smart, with original music and editing by Alex Cottrell. The producer is Sarah Peverley.
Down in the depths of the ocean, where the sea is the most exquisite shade of royal blue, the water is always still, even when the most violent storms are sinking ships above. In these calm blue depths dwell the merfolk, hundreds of mermen and mermaids living in shell houses hidden within forests of seaweed. High above, fish drift by like clouds in the sky, casting shadows on the seabed below. And nestled between two rising marine mountains is the palace where the Mer King once dwelt, with his mother and 6 beautiful daughters. Though to landfolk all mermaids are lovely beyond compare, these princesses were the loveliest mermaids of all, and their names were Serena, Electa, Theta, Delphina, Sita, and the youngest and most radiant of all was Aurea. All day the little mermaids would sing and play in the seagrass meadows that surrounded the palace, riding giant seahorses, searching for treasure in fallen shipwrecks, or tending their underwater gardens. Whilst her sisters would tend delicate flowers grown into the shapes of a prancing seahorse or a dancing mermaid, Aurea's garden was a simple sunburst of anemones, at the centre of which was a marble statue of a handsome young man that she'd found one day in a sunken shipwreck. Aurea would spend hours gazing at her statue, wondering what had happened to the young man. Each evening when the day was drawing to a close, the little mermaids would return to their father's palace for their daily lessons with their grandmother. Firstly, they would practice their mermaid song, singing so harmoniously that sailors on the surface could swear they heard a choir of angels singing. Then, their grandmother, speaking with the knowledge of almost 250 years, would tell them about the oceans and the strange world of the land above. "The land folk are unlike us in many ways," the grandmother would always begin. "While we can live for 300 years or more, most men and women live just 70 years of life. Instead of tails, the landfolk have 2 limbs called legs, which are very knobbly and ungraceful. As we live, breathe, and move through the water, humans do so in the air. The landfolk do not have gills like us. Instead, they breathe through their mouths and noses, for the air surrounds them as the ocean surrounds us, beginning at the surface and reaching up into the skies. They need it to survive." The little mermaids sat in awe, imagining how very big the world of the land must be if it went all the way to the skies. Their grandmother told them many wonders of the land, the vast land forests and giant land mountains, the great dry desert where there was not a single drop of water in sight, the many different animals and plants, and the scents that accompanied them, the sweetness of the flowers, and the earthy smell of the land. Seeing her granddaughter's eyes twinkle with excitement, she hastily added a warning. "But we are not made for the world of the land, as the land folk are not made for our world. We must never spend too much time at the surface, or we might become as monstrous and grotesque as the sea witch." The little mermaids gasped in terror. The hideousness of the sea witch was well known throughout the Mer Kingdom. No one would wish to share a similar fate. "There are many dangers on the land. The fiery sun, the harsh air, and the most dangerous of all, the land folk themselves. Never wish to live amongst the land folk, my dears, or dwell on the land. It will only bring you sorrow. This was how most of their lessons ended, with words of warning. But all the little mermaids longed to visit the land above and see the wonders for themselves, none more so than the youngest, Aria. And so the little mermaids waited patiently for the day of their 15th birthdays, when, by the tradition of the sea, they would be allowed to see the wonders for themselves. For when a mermaid reached her 15th birthday, she is no longer considered a child and is allowed to venture to the surface and learn from what she sees. From this knowledge, she is given a lifelong duty to perform. As time passed, each sister waited patiently for the day of her 15th birthday, until, at last, Serena, the eldest of the Mer King's daughters, came of age. Serena was bejewelled with oyster shells and a crown of pearls. Then an escort of dolphins and seahorses assembled to guide her to the surface. As they left, her 5 younger sisters eagerly waved goodbye and spent the rest of the day tending their gardens, dreaming excitedly of their own 15th birthday and longing to hear of the wonders that Serena had seen. Upon her return that evening, her sisters listened in awe as she spoke of the vastness of the skies and the beauty of the stars reflected in the calm night sea. And so, the Mer King declared that Serena's duty would be to tame the midnight sea, so that all the merfolk could better see the bright night stars. The stars, thought Aria, the youngest mermaid. I can't wait to see the stars. The following year, it was Electa's 15th birthday, and when she returned, she spoke of the wonders of the sunset, how the sky had turned from the brightest blue to softest pink, and how the clouds had become like golden pearls. The stars and the sunset, thought Aria. Only 4 more years, and then I shall see them for myself. A year later, Theta turned 15, and returned telling tales of all the beautiful flowers and amazing animals that she had seen. The stars, the sunset, and the flowers, thought Aria. Yet it was still 3 years until the youngest of the little mermaids would visit the surface. Luckily, the next 2 sisters turned 15 in quick succession, as Delphina had been born at the year's beginning and Theta at its close. Delphina spent her birthday exploring the deep oceans and playing with the huge whales that lived there, laughing every time they sprayed her with fountains of water from their blowholes. And Theta had admired the snow and crisp, pearlescent icebergs. The stars, the sunset, the flowers, the fountains, and the snow, Aria thought to herself. Soon it will be my turn. After a year of tending her garden alone and gazing longingly at her marble prince, the day of Aria's 15th birthday finally arrived. The procession was a blur. Aria was barely conscious of how smart the seahorses looked or how elegantly the dolphins danced around her. Everything her grandmother and her sisters had told her swam through her head. The stars, the sunset, the flowers, the fountains, the snow, she repeated to herself, growing more and more excited as she reached the surface. The stars, the sunset, the flowers, the fountains, the snow. She was almost there. The stars, the sunset, the fountains, the flowers, the snow. And don't forget to breathe! Aria broke through the surface with a splash, setting drops of water dancing around her. She took a breath. The air burnt her throat. She coughed and spluttered, and then took another breath. It still burnt, but not as badly as the first. She looked around her. Delphina was right, she thought. It's amazing how far and wide the sea stretches. For as far as the eyes could see, there was nothing but the open sea. Except, in the distance, she could see something rising out of the water. Land! Arya swam towards it in excitement. When she reached the shore, she saw the beginnings of a great forest and a lavish white palace surrounded by beautiful flowers. She took a breath, smelt the earthiness of the land and the subtle sweetness of the flowers. Then she carried on along the coastline until the skies began to turn from blue through purple to pink, and the clouds became golden pearls. The sunset, Arya laughed. It's just as beautiful as Aletta said. Then turning towards the setting sun, Arya saw a mighty ship with many brightly coloured sails and a flag, bearing 3 legs running in a circle like the spokes of a wheel. How odd, Arya thought, swimming towards the ship. As she neared the vessel, she heard the most wonderful music. A man playing the lyre and singing as enchantingly as any merman. His face was bathed in soft candlelight. He was the most handsome man that Arya had ever seen. His angular chin and mop of dark curls reminded her of the statue in her garden. It was as if the marble had come to life. When the song ended, the sailors began to sing and dance to an exotic song. Arya followed the ship, watching the merriment, and wished that she had 2 legs so that she could spin and twirl and dance with the handsome young man. All too soon, the dancing came to an end, and the ship fell asleep. Arya knew that she should return home, but how could she leave this new world that she had discovered? The singing, the dancing, and the handsome young man. So, she stayed by the ship's side as it sailed silently into the night, hardly noticing the stars that Serena had told her about. About an hour before dawn, the stars began to disappear as clouds rolled across the dark skies. The wind whipped up waves that began to rock the ship from side to side, and rain began to fall. Tiny drops at first, then becoming heavier and heavier. The waves began to rock the ship with greater and greater force, throwing it high into the sky and plunging it down into the waves below. Suddenly, the sky was filled with light, and Arya heard the most terrible sound. She dived below the waves in fear. She had never heard such a terrible sound. This must be one of my father's storms, she thought, and she tentatively returned to the surface, in time to see the mast of the great ship snap in 2 and plunge into the raging sea, taking the ship and sailors with it to a watery grave. Arya looked on in horror. The thought of the young man's body lying cold on the ocean floor made her sadder than she had ever been. But no tears fell from her eyes, for mermaids know not how to cry. She dived down and rose, and dived again, frantically searching for the handsome young man. But he was nowhere to be seen. Just as she was about to follow the sinking ship deeper into the ocean, a shape moved over the crest of a wave. A flash of white. A shirt, maybe? She swam towards it, and found the handsome young man sinking into the dark, stormy waters. She took him in her arms and began to swim as fast as she could, on and on and on, until finally they escaped the storm. She swam for what felt like hours, through the changing colours of the morning, until at last she sighted land. With the last of her strength, she swam towards the shoreline and along the shallows until she saw a small temple on a hill, covered in vines. Then pulling him onto the beach, using her tail to propel them across the powdery sand, she finally lay back, exhausted. As the morning sun passed along the beach, she turned towards the handsome young man and stroked his sea-sodden hair out of his face. Then she noticed the chain round his neck, at the end of which was a pendant in the shape of a crown. "A prince!" exclaimed Arya, smiling and kissing him softly on the forehead. Arya would have stayed with the young man for the rest of her days, but she heard a sound coming from the hill. Ladies' voices and a soft jingling of bells. Reluctantly, she returned to the sea as the bells drew closer. She stayed watching, just long enough to see a group of women, dressed in long flowing fabrics, approach the prince, then carry him away back to the temple. I will never see him again, Arya thought, as she sunk sadly beneath the waves. Her heart felt as if it would break. But no tears fell from her eyes, for mermaids know not how to cry. When she eventually found her way back to the Merking's palace, her father was furious. The merfolk had searched all night for her, for they feared that she had been captured by fishermen, and the Merking had sent up a storm to free her. The storm, the shipwreck, they were my fault, thought Arya, struck by an even deeper sadness. With great solemnity, she told her father all that she had seen: the stars, the sunset, the flowers, the ship, the sailors, and the prince that she had saved. The Merking granted Arya the duty of creating a gentle sea breeze to help carry ships safely home to their harbours, but he forbade her from ever touching the land again, lest she be captured and hurt. And so she did. Swimming to the surface every day, she made a gentle sea breeze to carry ships safely home. But each day, she grew paler and sadder, for she knew that she would never touch the land or see her prince again. One day, after years of sadness, her sisters brought her news of a ship with brightly coloured sails and a strange flag bearing 3 legs running in a circle like the spokes of a wheel. Fast as they could, they swam to the ship and watched it sail into harbour. There, on the beach, greeting the returning vessel, was Arya's prince. Suddenly she was filled with more joy than she ever thought she'd feel again. She kissed her sisters with thanks. "Now you can visit him whenever you wish," said Serena. But Arya knew it was not enough. She knew what she must do. That night, she said a silent goodbye to her father, grandmother, and sisters, and swam off to find the Sea Witch. The Sea Witch lived in a different part of the ocean from the merfolk, in a deep, dark cavern when the water ran cold. Instead of the seagrass meadows and fertile forests of seaweed, the remains of huge sea beasts and the skeletons of ships lost centuries past surrounded the cavern. Down and deeper she swam, until at last she reached the Sea Witch's lair. A mass of bones and broken masts formed the gateway, and a path of writhing eels led to the pitch-black entrance. As Arya swam past, the eels tried to grab her and drag her down. Once they almost succeeded, but she managed to swim free. And not a moment too soon, she reached the doorway. "Come in, my dear," a voice from the darkness called. Arya swam towards it, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The water here was not clear but murky and stung her eyes. Shapes shifted in the shadows. One moved towards her, shrouded in a long, dark cloak. As a child, she'd been told many stories of the Sea Witch. She was a monster, with hideous tentacles and scales instead of skin. But as the Sea Witch came closer, she saw that she was just a mermaid like her. "What brings the youngest daughter of the Merking to me?" Arya could not answer. She was too full of fear. She didn't like this place and she didn't like the Sea Witch. But she did need her help. "Can you make me like one of the landfolk?" Arya asked. The Sea Witch nodded. "I have a potion that'll rip your tail in 2 and give you 2 legs, to make you like one of the landfolk. But only for 1 year. To remain on land forever,
A land dweller must give you their heart, willingly.
Arya smiled and thought of her prince.
But,
warned the sea witch,
if after the sun sets on that final day, and you do not possess a human heart, you will die. Or worse, you may become like me.
The sea witch removed her cape with a flourish, revealing 2 legs sewn together to make a single tail. It ended not with fins, but with 2 huge cockle-covered feet. Arya swam back in horror, shaking her head as the sea witch covered her grotesque tail again. But Arya had made up her mind. She made her deal with the sea witch, offering her crown as payment.
No, dear,
chuckled the sea witch cruelly.
Remarkable magic requires remarkable sacrifice. You must give me that which you hold most dear. I require your mermaid song.
Arya clasped her throat. But how will I tell the prince who I am? She pleaded.
Child,
soothed the sea witch, taking her hand.
Mermaids and humans do not speak the same language. We speak the language of the sea. You will neither be able to speak to your prince nor understand him.
Arya's heart sank deeper, and her face turned pale.
But don't worry. I can craft a spell to remove your gills and give you ears that will enable you to understand the landfolk, though I cannot make you speak. I'm sure you will find other ways to communicate.
Hesitating for a moment, Arya thought of her family. Though she would miss them, she knew that she would never be happy confined to the seas. And so she agreed, giving her voice in exchange for the sea witch's potion. Then, as fast as she could, she swam towards the surface. The stars, the sunset, the fountains, the flowers, the snow, the prince, Arya thought, excited for her new adventure. The stars, the sunset, the fountains, the flowers, the snow, the prince, and don't forget to breathe! Arya broke through the surface of the water, as excited as on the day of her 15th birthday. And as the sun began to rise, Arya reached the beach where she saw the prince the day before, and drank the sea witch's potion. As soon as the last few drops passed her lips, a sharp and sudden pain spread from her fins, almost to her waist, as her tail ripped in two. It was more painful than anything she had ever felt before. It was more than she could bear. She fell into a deep sleep. When she woke, she felt herself between soft bedsheets in the middle of a huge room. She stretched, feeling her legs tingle. She felt a stabbing like 1,000 tiny knives at the bottom of her feet. Smiling ladies came to her, called her princess, dressed her in a beautiful gown and brushed all the tangles and seashells out of her hair. Then, finally, she saw the prince. "Welcome to our kingdom, princess," he said, smiling. "I've come to return your crown to you. I had it cleaned. It was covered in all sorts of sea life and seaweed." Then the prince gently returned her crown to her head. He asked her many questions that morning: who she was, where she came from, what had happened to her. But Arya could not say a word. She could only smile. As the morning passed into the afternoon, the prince asked her one final question. "Perhaps you'll find your words again with time, but until then, would you like to see my kingdom?" Arya nodded, beaming, and taking the prince's hand began a new adventure. To tell of even half the things they did that year would take far too long. Needless to say, the seasons changed and the year passed in a blink of an eye. They journeyed through the prince's lands, and Arya saw more wonders than she ever could have dreamt of. They climbed the tallest mountains, piled high with cold whiteness. "The snow!" thought Arya, remembering what Sita had told her. Then the spring came, and they visited the greenest of forests. The prince gave her gifts of flowers and beautiful clothes. He even gave her his locket, so fond he was of her. But he did not give her his heart. In the summer, the prince threw Arya a wondrous ball, where they danced together all night long, even though her legs throbbed in pain. They were inseparable. And so, when his father the king sent the prince to a foreign land, Arya went too. I think my father wants me to marry the princess of the land we are to visit, the prince told Arya as they were preparing for their journey. She has been on a pilgrimage lasting many years, visiting temples across the world. Now she's returning home and wishes to secure peace for her kingdom through a marriage. But I won't marry her, don't worry, he smiled, kissing Arya on the cheek. I will not marry anyone who I do not love with my whole heart, and you are dearer to me than any princess. He laughed, and Arya was pleased. She was glad that she was dear to him. But her year was almost over, and he had not given her his heart. There is only one maiden in the whole world I could ever marry, he exclaimed suddenly, and told Arya about the great storm that had sunk his ship, and about the beautiful maiden that had saved him from it. The prince told Arya that that maiden was the only woman that he could ever marry and give his heart to. Arya's heart almost flew out of her chest, for it was she that had saved him from the storm. It was she that he could love. But she did not have the words to tell him. The voyage to the distant land was calm, and Arya and the prince spent many nights dancing together happily on board the ship, though she was sad that she could not join in with the songs. Eventually, they reached the kingdom of the foreign princess, and as they stepped ashore, they heard a soft tinkling of bells. It's her, whispered the prince, almost under his breath. And there before them, to welcome them to her realm, stood a beautiful young woman with warm brown eyes and long, thick black hair. She wore long, loose-fitting fabrics of blue and gold, and on her head a shawl covered with tiny bells. It was the foreign princess that Arya's prince was to marry, and it was the same maiden that had found the prince on the beach with her ladies-in-waiting when Arya had saved him. She had taken him to safety, and had wished to take care of him herself, but she too was a stranger in that land and needed to continue her own journey. She had loved him just as the prince had loved her, and both were overjoyed that they were to be married. But Arya was heartbroken. She had given up everything to be with her prince, and although he cared for her deeply, it was not enough. The prince and princess were married the next day, and the wedding celebrations took place on board the ship as it carried them back to the prince's kingdom. But Arya's year had come to an end. She spent her last night gazing across the sea and thinking of all that she had lost. The prince and princess, hating to see her so sad, wished to make her happy again. The prince began to play his lyre and the princess danced, but Arya would not join in. Just before dawn, while the rest of the ship was asleep, Arya's sisters appeared to her, rising from the waves, starlight glinting off their sea-covered skin. "Return to us! Return to the sea," they begged. "We cut off our hair to save you. The sea witch said we could use it to undo her spell, and she's weaving it into a magical thread to rebind your legs into a mermaid tail. But you will remember nothing of the land, or your prince," Serena added, sadly. Arya was filled with an overwhelming sadness, and tears began to fall from her eyes, for she had finally learned how to cry. She was greatly moved by how much her sisters had done to save her, but knew she could never give up the life on the land that she had known. Though she had learnt to cry, she had also learnt to walk, to dance, to climb mountains, and had seen more wondrous things than she ever could have imagined. "Please, Arya," her sisters begged, "come now or you will die." For the sun had begun to rise, turning the skies from pink through purple to soft blue. The stars, the sunset, the flowers, the fountains, the snow, the prince, Arya thought, as she blew each of her sisters a kiss. As the first rays of the new sun touched her skin, Arya closed her eyes, and her cold, human body fell to the waves and turned to sea foam. Arya felt her body become one with the sea, felt the sun warm her watery form. And then she began to rise. She opened her eyes and looked down at herself. She was made of air and was floating high above the sea amongst the clouds. Arya looked around and saw others just like her dancing through the air. One young man approached her. He looked kind, and when he smiled, the sun shone through his face, gentle and warm.
"We are the air folk,"
he said softly.
"We live in the air as men and women live on the land, and mermaids and mermen live in the sea. We saw how much you cared for the prince, and how much you loved adventure. So we decided to save you from your curse. Will you join us and help us carry the sea breeze to sailors lost at sea? In return, you can explore the world of the air as much as you wish."
Arya was amazed. She hadn't even known this world existed. She looked into the eyes of the young man and nodded. Then, taking his hand, they sent a cool breeze billowing into the sail of the prince's ship, before turning towards the sun to begin a new adventure in the world of the air folk. The end.
The Little Mermaid was originally produced for Being Human 2016, a festival of the humanities, by Sarah Peverley and the Liverpool Players. It was written and performed by Madeline Smart, and the music and editing was by Alex Cottrell. For updates and information about future productions, you can follow the Liverpool Players on Twitter and Instagram using @LiveUniPlayers.